Alcoholic stepmother abandons wheelchair-bound stepdaughter in the forest at night. Then a wolf appears, and a tragedy horrifies everyone. The night was darker than usual. The forest seemed to have swallowed the last bit of light left in the sky. Clara, sitting in her wheelchair, shivered. Not just from the cold that pierced her delicate skin, but from the growing fear inside her, like a relentless monster. She looked around, hoping to hear footsteps, voices, any sign that it was all a mistake, that Sophia would return to fetch her. But the silence was deafening. Only the sound of the wind, rustling the leaves like a mocking whisper, kept her company. Clara was only 10 years old. Despite her young age, she already knew her stepmother didn't like her. Sophia never bothered to hide it. The disdainful looks, sharp words, and harsh gestures had become part of Clara's daily life. But never, not even in her worst thoughts, had she imagined Sophia capable of something so cruel. At that moment, sitting in the car's back seat, Clara noticed something different in Sophia's eyes. They were red, filled with rage and alcohol, a dangerous mix Clara knew too well. The strong smell of booze filled the small space, and every word from Sophia's mouth was drenched in contempt. "You're nothing but a burden," she shouted, her voice slurred and full of resentment. Clara tried to respond, to explain that it wasn't her fault, that she just wanted to go home, but no words came out. The fear burned in her chest like a fireball, choking her. Before she could think or act, the car door was yanked open. The icy night air rushed in, making Clara shiver. Sophia, her face twisted with anger, grabbed her arm with such force that Clara felt a jolt of pain. "Stay here. I'm done with you," the woman yelled, shoving Clara to the roadside as if she were nothing. Clara watched the car door slam shut, and the engine roared as Sophia sped away. The sound of tires on the dirt road felt like the announcement of the end. When the engine noise finally faded, silence fell over Clara like an avalanche, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to scream, to beg Sophia to come back, but her voice seemed to have disappeared along with the car. It was as if fear had stolen everything from her, her words, her courage, even her strength to cry. All that remained were the cruel words echoing in her head, repeating over and over, "You're nothing but a burden." With each repetition, the pain in Clara's chest grew, as if her heart were being squeezed. She looked around, but all she could see was darkness. The night seemed even more terrifying now, and the loneliness so overwhelming that she felt like she was disappearing, as if no one would ever find her. The cold wind stung her face, but what hurt the most was the abandonment. A vast emptiness engulfed her, swallowing everything around her. Clara looked at her trembling hands and clutched the thin blanket on her lap. It was her only protection against the cold night and a world that seemed so unfair. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't even try to wipe them away. What was the point? She was alone. Completely alone. As minutes passed, the silence of the forest seemed to come alive. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, and Clara's imagination filled in the rest. Would an animal emerge from the shadows to attack her? Had Sophia gone home and claimed she'd vanished? What if no one came looking for her? Each question tightened the knot in Clara's throat. She felt such deep despair that it seemed as if the ground beneath her wheelchair had vanished. It was like she was falling into an endless void, where fear and helplessness consumed her completely. Clara had always known she was different from other kids. Her disability reminded her of that every day. Every look of pity, every time she needed help with something simple, every moment she couldn't play like she wanted, it all reinforced that difference. But now, alone in the darkness, it felt even more cruel. She looked at her small, trembling hands and then at her unresponsive legs. A thought flashed through her mind like lightning. What if I could run? What if I could escape? But she couldn't. Her wheelchair felt like a prison in that moment, a constant reminder that she had no way to defend herself or flee. The air felt heavy, hard to breathe. The knot in her throat grew tighter with every second as the weight of her vulnerability became unbearable. Clara knew other children might be able to run, scream, maybe even find a way out. But her? She was trapped here, dependent on someone who had abandoned her. The thought hurt more than any cruel word she had ever heard. She asked herself, for the 1000th time, why it had to be this way. Why did she have to be so different? Why couldn't she be like everyone else, free to choose her own path? Each time this question surfaced, the despair grew stronger, like a wave crashing down and crushing her from within. At that moment, loneliness wasn't just the absence of someone by her side. It was the feeling that the whole world had decided she didn't belong anywhere. And that hurt more than the cold, more than the fear of the forest around her. It hurt because, for the first time, Clara felt completely alone with her disability, with no one to help her, no one to understand what it was like to be her. Before we continue, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you love animals and their emotional stories. The night grew colder, and Clara curled up, seeking warmth from the thin blanket draped over her. The silence of the forest, once terrifying, now seemed to scream in her ears. Then, suddenly, a different sound broke through, the rustling of bushes. Clara froze. Her heart began to race so fast it felt as if it might leap out of her chest. She tried to look around, but the darkness was so dense she could see nothing but distorted shadows. Another sound. Closer this time. Clara held her breath, feeling a chill run down her spine. And then, it appeared. First, it was the eyes, two glowing points that seemed to lock onto hers. Then, the figure slowly emerged from the darkness. A wolf. Large, its fur a mix of grey and black, with mesmerizing eyes that shone like small torches. Clara felt fear take over. She knew what a wolf was, she had seen them in books and heard stories. They were dangerous, relentless predators. And now, one stood just a few meters away from her. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped. She wanted to move, but her hands were glued to the arms of her wheelchair, trembling. The wolf didn't approach immediately. It stood still, watching her, as if assessing every movement, every detail. Clara couldn't look away, even as panic surged within her. Her mind raced with unanswered questions. Will it attack me? Is it hungry? The wolf took a step forward. Slowly, silently. Clara felt the air grow heavier. But then, something unexpected happened. It didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth. It just looked at her. Its eyes held no threat but something Clara couldn't decipher, a mix of curiosity and calm. It was as if the animal sensed her fragility, as if it knew she couldn't escape. Clara's fear began to share space with another feeling, something she didn't understand. She was still terrified, but at the same time, something about the wolf's gaze felt different, almost comforting. It was wild, enormous, and intimidating, yet Clara didn't feel it wanted to harm her. On the contrary, there was something in its stance that made it seem as though it was there for a reason. And so, the two remained, staring at each other. Clara, a vulnerable little girl, and the wolf, a wild creature, separated only by a short distance and a vast barrier of fear and mystery. Clara stayed frozen, every muscle in her body tense. Her eyes never left the wolf, which now moved closer, step by step. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the animal could hear it. Her fear was so intense that even breathing felt difficult. But then, something surprising happened. The wolf stopped just a few feet from Clara and raised its head. Its ears perked up, its eyes alert. It seemed to be listening to something Clara couldn't hear. Suddenly, it turned slightly, positioning itself between her and the darkness of the forest. Clara noticed the wolf wasn't looking at her anymore. It was staring at the distant bushes. A crackling sound. Clara clearly heard branches breaking in the direction the wolf was watching. Her whole body trembled, but the wolf didn't move. Instead, it let out a low growl, deep and steady, like a warning. Clara's fear of being attacked by the wolf began to shift. It didn't seem to threaten her. No. It seemed to protect her. Clara was confused. Why would it do that? She was just a helpless little girl, alone in a wheelchair, and it was a wild animal, a predator. Yet there it was, standing between her and whatever was in the forest, like a true guardian. Its stance was strong, as if ready to face anything that dared to come closer. Another sound. This time nearer. The wolf growled again, louder. Clara couldn't see anything beyond the shadows, but the wolf seemed to see everything. A small wave of relief washed over her, as if, somehow, that animal was looking out for her. It was a strange yet powerful feeling. For the first time that night, Clara didn't feel entirely alone. She looked at the wolf, and for a moment its eyes met hers again. There was something in that gaze she couldn't explain. It wasn't just an animal looking at her, it felt like it was saying, "I'm here." And Clara, though she didn't understand it, felt she could believe that. The sound in the bushes faded, and the wolf lowered its head but stayed by her side, alert as if still on guard. Clara didn't know what would happen next, but something inside her told her that this wolf wasn't going to leave her. It was there, not as a threat, but as an unexpected protector life had sent her in her moment of greatest need. Meanwhile, Miguel, her grandfather, was frantically making his way through the forest. Clara's disappearance had ignited a mix of fear and guilt within him, making him ignore the cold, the branches scratching his face, and the exhaustion tightening his chest. He knew Sophia was unpredictable, but he never imagined the woman capable of abandoning his granddaughter like that. "Clara, hold on, please," he muttered, shining his flashlight on the ground, searching for any sign of her. Miguel found tire tracks at the forest's edge and then Clara's blanket, the one she always kept on her lap. It was enough to confirm he was on the right path. His heart raced with every step, but so did his fear. He imagined the worst, Clara alone, exposed to the cold, hunger, or even the wild animals roaming the night. The thought made him quicken his pace, even though his legs were already weary. When he finally reached the clearing, the beam of his flashlight illuminated a scene he never expected. Clara was there, in her wheelchair, her eyes wide open, and a wolf. A massive wolf standing beside her, like a living statue. The animal was upright, alert, staring directly at Miguel. The rifle in his hands trembled. It was instinct. Wolves were dangerous. But then, he noticed something strange. Clara didn't look scared. In fact, she seemed protected. "Grandpa," her voice was weak but filled with relief. Miguel took a step forward, but the wolf didn't move. It remained firm, staring at him as if assessing whether he was a threat. Miguel raised his hand, trying to show he meant no harm. "It's okay, Clara. I'm here," he said, as calmly as he could manage. Clara's gaze met his, but she couldn't stop talking about the wolf. "Grandpa, he protected me. He stayed with me the whole time," she said, her voice brimming with emotion. Miguel didn't know what to say. He had heard stories about animals displaying strange, almost human-like behavior, but seeing it with his own eyes was entirely different. The wolf didn't just seem to be there, it seemed to understand. For a few minutes, Miguel stood still, observing. The wolf looked at Clara with an expression that almost seemed caring. There was no aggression, only a protective attentiveness. A chill ran down Miguel's spine. This wasn't just a wild animal. There was something different about this wolf. Something he couldn't explain but could undeniably feel. Finally, the wolf took a step back, as if to say, "She's safe now." It stood there, watching as Miguel approached Clara, embraced her, and held her tightly. Miguel remained cautious but realized the animal had no intention of causing harm. In fact, it seemed to be there to ensure Clara's safety until her grandfather arrived. As Miguel pushed Clara's wheelchair out of the clearing, the wolf didn't leave. It followed them closely, as if wanting to ensure nothing happened to them. Each step it took was silent, but its presence was so striking that Miguel couldn't ignore it. Clara, on the other hand, seemed at ease. To her, this wolf wasn't just an animal. It was a guardian, an unexpected friend in her moment of greatest need. And Miguel, though he couldn't fully comprehend what was happening, couldn't help but feel grateful. He knew, somehow, that this wolf had been Clara's salvation. And that, in itself, was a miracle. Miguel adjusted the blanket over Clara, making sure she was warm. His eyes stayed on the wolf, which still accompanied them like a silent shadow. The animal walked beside them with firm steps and a watchful gaze, as if its mission was not yet complete. For Miguel, every snap of a branch or distant sound made his heart race, but the wolf seemed to sense everything before he did. At every noise, the animal's ears twitched, and it stopped to survey the surroundings before moving on. Clara, however, was unusually calm. She looked at the wolf as one would look at a friend. Despite everything she had endured, the animal made her feel safe. "He's not going to leave us, "Grandpa," she said with a confidence that made Miguel pause. How could she be so sure? It was a wolf, a wild and unpredictable creature. Yet Miguel couldn't deny what he was seeing. The wolf showed no signs of threat, only a behavior that defied any logical explanation. As Miguel pushed the wheelchair, he noticed how the wolf kept its head held high, its paws moving softly over the leaf-covered ground. It seemed to be guiding the way, ensuring everything was safe. When the path narrowed and Miguel had to maneuver around a fallen tree, the wolf stopped and stayed beside Clara, as if waiting to make sure she wasn't left alone for even a second. The walk felt endless, but in the distance, Miguel finally saw the glow of his truck's headlights parked at the forest's edge. He sighed in relief. "We're almost there, Clara," he said, trying to hide the emotion in his voice. Clara, however, didn't take her eyes off the wolf. To her, that moment was as significant as reaching home. It was as if she wanted to hold on to every detail, already knowing she would never forget this animal. When they finally reached the forest's edge, the wolf stopped. It stood still, watching as Miguel lifted Clara into the truck's passenger seat and adjusted her seatbelt. Miguel looked at the animal, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something in that gaze deeper than anything Miguel had ever seen. Was it gratitude? A farewell? He didn't know. Clara leaned her head out of the window. "Thank you, my friend," she said with a weak but sincere smile. The wolf didn't move. It just stood there, watching, as if ensuring they were truly safe. Only after the truck engine started and Miguel slowly drove away did the wolf turn and vanish into the shadows of the trees. The silence in the truck was heavy, but not from fear. It was a silence of respect, of something that didn't need to be spoken. Miguel drove carefully, while Clara, exhausted, clutched the blanket and thought about the wolf. That night, it had been more than just an animal to her. It had been a protector, a friend, something neither she nor Miguel would ever forget. Back at home, Clara was enveloped in the warmth of Miguel's embrace and the familiar scent of the blankets he carefully tucked around her on the sofa. But even surrounded by the safety of home, her mind was elsewhere. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the wolf, those bright, attentive eyes and its firm, protective stance etched in her memory as if burned there. Miguel, sitting beside her, couldn't hide his concern. He knew Clara was physically safe, but what she had endured that night was something no adult, let alone a child, should have to experience. He tried to start a conversation, but Clara was quiet. It wasn't the usual silence. It was the silence of someone who had faced something beyond words. "Grandpa, do you think he's still there, in the forest?" Clara finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with emotion. Miguel looked at her, unsure how to respond. He saw something in her eyes, something different. Clara seemed stronger, but also more distant, as if the experience had changed something within her. "Maybe he is, Clara. Maybe he's out there, looking after the forest. And maybe he only showed up because he knew you needed him." Miguel's words brought a faint smile to Clara's face, but soon tears began to fall. They weren't just from sadness, it was a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't yet fully understand. The abandonment, the fear, the vulnerability, it all lingered like a heavy shadow. But at the same time, there was something new. A kind of strength, a certainty that she had faced the worst and, somehow, come through it. She held her grandfather's hand, gripping it tightly. "He stayed with me, Grandpa. He didn't leave. I thought I was alone, but he stayed." Miguel felt the weight of her words and the lump forming in his throat. He knew Clara wasn't just talking about the wolf. She was processing Sophia's abandonment, the cruelty of someone who was supposed to care for her. And somehow, that wild animal, which should have been a danger, had become the symbol of everything she needed at that moment: protection, companionship, strength. That night, Clara struggled to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the moments in the forest. But alongside the fear came the image of the wolf, by her side, steady, like a shield against the darkness. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of him. In the dream, he was in the forest, walking among the trees but always looking back, as if watching over her, ensuring she was safe. Miguel stayed awake for hours, watching Clara sleep. He knew that night had left deep scars on his granddaughter, but he also noticed something that filled him with pride. Clara wasn't the same girl anymore. She was still fragile, still carrying the pain of abandonment, but now there was something new in her. A quiet strength, a flame he knew wouldn't be easily extinguished. The wolf hadn't just protected Clara that night, it had left a part of its courage with her, something no fear could ever take away. The next morning brought a mix of relief and tension. Clara was safe, but the memories of the previous night still weighed heavily on her mind. Miguel, as he prepared breakfast, wore a serious and thoughtful expression. He knew he couldn't let what Sophia did go unpunished. Abandoning Clara wasn't just cruel, it was a crime. Miguel felt indignation growing within him, a rare anger that he couldn't suppress. After ensuring Clara was comfortable on the couch, Miguel picked up the phone and made the call he had been rehearsing in his mind since returning from the forest. He explained everything to the police, how he had found Clara alone in the forest and the emotional state she was in. Each word he spoke seemed heavier but brought a small sense of relief. This cannot happen again. No one, especially a child, deserves to be treated this way, he concluded. The authorities acted quickly. Sophia was summoned to testify and initially tried to deny everything. She played the victim, claiming Clara was difficult and that she had no choice. But Miguel's account, the evidence from the forest, and Clara's emotional state were enough to dismantle any lies Sophia tried to tell. Her cruelty sparked outrage in the small community where they lived. People were shocked to learn what Clara had endured. Friends and neighbors, many of whom had previously avoided getting involved, began to rally, offering help to Miguel and Clara. Meanwhile, Clara overheard the conversations around her but said little. She was still processing everything. Sophia had always been a burden to her, a person who never showed affection and constantly sidelined her. But now, Clara felt something different. It wasn't fear or sadness, it was something closer to relief. Knowing Sophia would no longer be around meant, for the first time, she could imagine a future without that negative presence in her life. Days later, Miguel received the news that Sophia had been officially charged and would face legal consequences. He felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction in seeing justice served, but sadness for all Clara had to endure to get to this point. He knew the road to recovery would be long, but at least now they could begin to build a new life together, free from Sophia's shadow. That evening, Miguel sat beside Clara and held her hand. "I promise you, my girl, no one will ever hurt you like that again. You're strong, Clara. Stronger than anything I've ever seen." For the first time since the incident, Clara gave a genuine smile. It was small but full of meaning. She knew the pain wouldn't fade quickly, but she also knew she now had something she'd never had before, security. And with it came the hope that better days lay ahead. The days passed, but Clara couldn't forget the wolf. He appeared in her dreams, always watchful, always by her side. During the day, as she tried to return to her routine, something inside her told her he was still nearby. Miguel began noticing signs too: paw prints around the house, a distant howl at night, as if the wolf was letting them know he was still watching over Clara. One afternoon, as Clara sat by the window looking out at the forest, she saw something that made her heart race. Between the trees, a familiar figure moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Clara knew it was him. Her guardian hadn't left. "Grandpa, he's there," she said, pointing excitedly. Miguel looked but could only see the forest shadows. He gave a soft smile. "Maybe he is, Clara. Maybe he's looking after you in his own way." The wolf's presence seemed to give Clara a strength she'd never had before. She began facing her fears with more courage, speaking with greater confidence. The experience in the forest hadn't just traumatized her. It had left a mark that, while painful, also helped her grow. Clara was no longer the same girl who had been abandoned on that cold night. Now, she had something new within her, an unshakable confidence. Miguel was amazed by the changes. Before, Clara was afraid to try new things, always hesitating, as if her disability were an insurmountable barrier. Now, she was determined. When she fell from her wheelchair trying to reach a book on the shelf, she simply laughed and said, "I can do it, Grandpa." And she did. Miguel watched her with a mix of pride and admiration. Clara was transforming before his eyes. Despite her strength, Clara still bore the scars of what she had endured. Sometimes she cried at night, reliving Sophia's abandonment. But in those moments she remembered the wolf, how he had stayed by her side, never leaving her for a second. That thought comforted her. It was as if the wolf had left a piece of his courage with her, something she could carry forever. One day, as Miguel and Clara walked through the yard, she stopped and looked toward the forest. "Do you think he'll come back, Grandpa?" Miguel was silent for a moment before replying, "I don't think he ever left, Clara. He's always nearby, even if we don't see him." Clara smiled. She knew her grandfather was right. The wolf wasn't just an animal that saved her that night. He was a symbol of strength, protection, and resilience. And even if she never saw him again, he would always be with her, in her memory and in her heart. That experience, as painful as it had been, transformed Clara. She discovered she was stronger than she ever imagined, capable of facing her fears and overcoming them. And most importantly, she learned that sometimes help and courage come from the most unexpected places, even from a wolf in the darkness of the forest. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Remember to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your opinion about this story.